Hey everyone, welcome back to Board Chats here on Private Club Radio, presented by our friends and partners, Concert Golf Partners, boutique owner-operator of private golf and country clubs nationwide. If you and or your club or a club that you know is looking for recapitalization, head on over to concertgolfpartners.com and set up a confidential phone call with Peter Nanula. I sit down with Jordan Peace and Christian Dunn, both of Concert Golf Partners, two knowledgeable experts who take us on a deep dive into the complexities of managing a successful club. And this two-part series is all about understanding successful board structures and optimal club health. In part one here, we talk about the optimal number of board members because too many can make decision-making very difficult and too few can hinder the representation of the membership as a whole. We talk about being proactive, engaging the club's health, because that is essential, which means listening to your club members to ensure a healthy membership experience and being ready to make changes when necessary. So let's welcome to this episode of Board Chats, Jordan Peace, SVP of Corporate Development, and Christian Dunn, Director of Corporate Development at Concert Golf Partners. You know, when it comes to boards and board structures, how big is like a good size board? Is there too big, too small? What's like the sweet spot?
Yeah, I can think of this. We talk to boards every day, right? And so we see, honestly, the percentage of boards that we talk to that seem to be running really well and really healthy is shockingly low. I don't know, Christian, 10, 15% that we're like, man, that's a great board, no politics. They all seem to be aligned, no personal agenda. It's actually a disappointing low number. That's not to say you can't operate dysfunctionally. I think that happens a lot. But I would say that the bigger the board gets, the harder it gets. And so you see a lot of probably 9 people boards, 9, 12, some 7. But I'd say around 9 is probably a number we see that, and that's still hard. I was once part of an association that merged with another association. I was on the board. And then the merger bylaws, we were like, okay, we have both boards. It was like 24 board members for a year before it went back down to 12. And board members were a mess. I mean, it was miserable. It was 24 people. And I know that was a unique time and a unique scenario. But I'm saying that to emphasize the fact that it's hard to get anything done and there's always opinions in the room. And so you have to have really, really strong leadership. I would never want to be on a board that had more than about 9 people. I just think it starts to add complexity. It starts to add agendas. But, too small and then, you probably aren't representing the club the way that your goals are to represent it. Christian,
I would tend to agree with that. I think, too many hands in the pot spoils the soup for sure. I think that I would argue that the most successful boards that I've seen and interacted with are ones where there's poignant leadership that is trusted by the other board members. I think it's really important. Normally what, Jordan and I see is 12 board members, 4 of which whom hold titled positions. So if you have a president, a VP, a treasurer, and say a secretary as sort of your 4 primary board members, and they may be carrying a large portion of the workload. And then you've got, maybe 8 or 6 more governors or board directors that are there to support them. As Jordan stated, represent, a little bit different side of that conversation or opinion or perspective in order to round out the agenda of the board and ensure that they are representative of the membership. I think that's the most successful for me, is to have that core group or really, pretty business, pretty pragmatic, and member oriented board president is really wonderful. Not just the number of them, but we hear a lot about, kind of bringing the integrity back and the respectability back of the board themselves. And that's kind of great. If there's a period where a membership or, the rest of the board isn't super confident, it's much more difficult to get things pushed through. So I think equally important to the number of board members is the representatives of the board and sort of how they function together and in larger part, to represent the club itself.
Christian made a great point, drawing on my own experience, that when I've been on boards, I was on a board for 6 years that turned over a lot. And I've been on a few boards, but in the season where that board worked the best was definitely when the executive committee, so the treasurer, the vice president, the past president, the secretary, when they were working well together, they're the ones who were really making the decision, bringing things to the rest of the board. And when they were working well together, whether I was on it or not on it, it made everything way easier. If the executive committee recommended something and everybody trusted the executive committee, it was going to be unanimous board. And so I think that is critical. It's having a good structure to where your executive committee is really strong, because, 9 people can't do it all. But if you have a few, 3 or 5, really trusted that are spending the most time on it, that's where you'll get an elite operator.
Is there a way to determine how many people is the best size for each individual club and situation? Like, I don't want to say criteria, but is there like a certain, meaning, is there a way that somebody might determine if their, board is maybe too big or too small, which obviously you just kind of answered. But, is there a criteria to determine exactly how many?
I think it's a fair question. I think for most clubs, it's in the bylaws how many seats there will be. So it's not something that's probably discussed much at all.
Gotcha.
And Jordan and I would tell you that that's where we feel that concert can be very advantageous, and that's our experience and kind of our model. But where maybe they should be having a discussion about how many board members and what they're, and defining a little more role clarity. And yet they're not, just because of the way that it's always been done.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to change those bylaws. It takes a process and a vote. And a lot of times you don't want to go through the vote because you don't want to go through the process. So it has to be something really critical in order to go through, the process of vote. These are volunteer board members, for example, right? So it's got to be something that's really critical to the club. And sometimes changing from 9 to 11 or 11 to 9 may not be something people want to spend the time on, because they have more pressing matters. They have capital needs. They have assessments to consider. They've got hires to make, right? Their staff. So, there is no formula of if you have this many members, you should have this many board members, right? I think it's, how many types of members do you have? Young, old, sports, non-sports, social, and making sure you have a fair representation on the board of kind of the subsets of your membership. I think that's the most important piece. So that would be what I was thinking about if I were on a board, is if I felt like we had 7 different kind of types of, like I just outlined, types of memberships, that we had a nice, diverse, representative, board of those people. And if you have tons of just golf, members, for example, you may want a few of those to represent the board, but you want to have everything represented. Kind of how I think about it. So is that 7? Is it 9? Is it 12? 15? Depends on the club, but that's kind of the filter I would run.
Is there, it's fresh perspectives, keeping it young, keeping it fresh, is very important. Then also while maintaining the member experience, and that sort of, I think, relates and goes back to the boards and how, malleable they are and, willing for change. How is there a length, like the ideal board length? And, I'm assuming some clubs might have things in their bylaws, but, how long should a board member ideally serve?
Yeah, I think Jordan and I both share the opinion that 1 year is probably not the best, only because most of the folks that are, again, donating their time as a volunteer, to operate as in governance for their own club, they do something else for a living, of course. And they're typically very successful in those other things. I mean, country clubs are, it's, you've earned the right to be there, and they often are very successful in their professional lives. But very few people can probably appreciate how dynamic a country club is. They've got, 90 to maybe 115 employees. They have pools, the driving ranges, a massive golf course with a huge maintenance crew operating industrial equipment. They've got a hospitality, service piece that's important. So there's just a lot of variables and moving parts, and they probably, how could they really understand everything at an in-depth level? So I would say, I think maybe 3 years for a board member is appropriate, because you do spend a little time navigating internally and finding some direction, learning about what's happened historically. And it gives you a little bit longer, tenure, just to understand what was successful and why, and then be able to see through some projects. If they do happen to have a longer project, I don't know when the last time you called a contractor to have a home renovation was, but they don't show up the very next day typically, and they don't have the project completed the day after that typically. And so to see through a bigger, the scope of a larger scale project from start to finish, and have not singular, but an agreed upon plan that you're able to, start to finish, follow through, I think is really important. And I think 3 years probably sets that up for a little bit more success. Potentially you could argue 2 years, but I find that a lot of the board members we speak to, it's not their first go around also. You've got sort of a segment, a pie piece of the total membership that is interested in governance. And so they may have, sat as just a board member, and now they're VP or treasurer or something. And so I think if you went much further than 3 years, if somebody in a 10-year span had 2 4-year terms or 5-year terms, I think you'd start to really, you just need to be aware that you don't want one person making all the decisions all the time, because as Jordan alluded to previously, I'm a golf guy. I respect that there are golf people that are going to be interested in strictly the golf course and its maintenance and the quality and speed of the greens and how beautiful the tee boxes are and that type of thing. And that's just not representative of everyone at the club. So you need to have voices. And yeah, I would say 3 years, I think, would be my answer.
Yeah, I agree. And we also, though, are seeing, the problem is we're seeing that, I talked about having diversity in your board. We're saying that it's becoming harder and harder to find people willing to serve on your volunteer board that represent, meaning that most people who want to volunteer have a lot of time. They may be typically retired. They may be somebody who's at the club 7 days a week. Well, they think a lot differently about the club and the decisions being made at the club than Christian would, who is a member at his club that's a few minutes from his house. And he shows up, plays 9 holes with his son in the afternoon. He may play a weekend round. He may have 1 meal a week with his family at the club. They're just busier. They're doing more stuff with their kids. They can't be at the club near as much as somebody who's playing, standing tee time 4 days a week. And so you do have this problem of getting the right people to actually volunteer. You can run into some issues at a club. And so, that's another, I guess, issue with the timeline is a lot of times you go 3 years, it's like, ooh, I'm not doing 3 years. Well, that is the appropriate amount of time. Because if you do 1 year roll off and on, you can't really, you're learning how to be a board member and then you roll off. And so, it's important to stagger too, right? A couple seats open up a year. So you always have a lot of congruency on the board, but that's becoming more and more harder and harder to do, especially as younger generations come, growing up in the club. So,
we're talking a little bit about evaluation. How do you evaluate your club's board health? So I'm Mr. XYZ. I'm on my board. I think you can almost tell, but are there some, I don't want to say flags, but how can I look at my board health and go like, I should probably reevaluate this?
I mean, I hate to say it like that. I don't want to be that, I don't want to not be that scientific, but like we were recently talking to a board where, we found the treasurer to be super thoughtful, very successful business guy. He was just being pragmatic to understand everything that was in his arsenal, right, to help his club. So he was talking to us and he took our conversations that we had a lot of and had some very thoughtful conversations about how we could fix some capital needs that they had, some very long-term expensive capital needs. And he took it to the board, and there were a few board members that just, were mad that he talked to anybody without them knowing. It had nothing to do with concert golf or X or a bank. He'd talk to banks. It was just the whole board meeting was spent on, wait, you did this work without us knowing you were doing this work. And he was kind of like, yeah, I thought I was being helpful. Like he was totally stunned. And so you see that board meeting became a board meeting about just politics or, kind of drama versus anything practical about where the club was headed.
Yeah.
And so he knows, his comment to me was, I can't wait to roll off this thing after that meeting. Right. And I was just surprised about that. And like I said, nothing to do with even our conversations or anything. Like it was just literally board politics, power control, I'm on the board for a reason. And those are when you start getting, dangerous for your club. There's a lot of decisions that can be made that can run your club into the ground. And we've seen it happen a lot before.
Yeah, I would add to that, a lot of what Jordan and I do is, of course, it begins with a conversation. That's the starting point. Somebody at a club, a representative, whether it's ownership or a board member, depending on the type of the club, they want to learn a little more. They want to find out, they want to gather information so that they can, articulate to anyone else that might be in the decision-making room, what their options are. And so we tend to think of those that are willing to consider all their possibilities as pretty sharp representatives of the club. And, in the instance that Jordan's describing, it's sort of too bad that here you have someone who's willing to go above and beyond, who's willing to think a little outside the box and really has the best interest of the club in mind, who's not enjoying their time on the board or is eager to be removed from the board as a result of the lack of support and teamwork that they're experiencing. So I would say that they sort of, they meaning the board members that we speak to and interact with, they kind of enlighten us as to whether or not the board is healthy and how functional it is. Some periods, as we referenced earlier, you've got a consensus about a style of governance. And when they do, they can achieve wonderful things and they can move a lot of projects forward and they can listen to the membership and attend to their needs and wants and address concerns. And if they don't, or if they're sort of agenda driven, which happens, it's really the member loses out, right? At that point, they're a equity member or a paying customer at the very least, and they'd like to show up and make sure that if they need a chicken sandwich on the menu, that it's there and that the tennis courts are resurfaced and that the golf course, of course, is maintained nicely, that the swim program has adequate support and training and, lifeguards if their children are down there. And so there's just so many different kind of perspectives of how people use the club and what they expect from it and get out of it. And I think overwhelmingly, that's the most important part of the board role, is to listen to those, voices and do the best they can to address them and ensure, a healthy membership experience.
So this all, boils down to, kind of taking a club and hopefully, when it's at its peak, it knows how to maintain and kind of keep that, that important club health. How do you monitor and evaluate, the ongoing health of a club? So we just kind of went from like the boards, now how do you like evaluate the overall club health? Let's just say from a board member and also just from like a member's point of view, like how can I, as Mr. Joe member who's not on the board and just like an average Joe, how can I look at my club and be like, hey, how can I start to maybe see some writings on the wall?
There's a few aspects. Yeah. I mean, it is hard for any private club board member. Like oftentimes what you hear as a board member or what you hear as a general manager is the negative stuff, right? It's easy for people to come up and complain about something that they want fixed. And then there's oftentimes a subset of members too who have never had anything to complain about, just very positive people. You can't make them mad if you try. And those are normally friends because they're easy to talk to, right? But like, what's the middle? How do you really dig in to understand how do the people that aren't upset enough to complain and aren't happy enough to come to you and tell you, like, how do you get feedback from them to really manage your club? And there's a few ways to do that. There's companies that do surveys, and obviously the better general managers or board members or companies, they're going to be asking, they're going to be trying to find pragmatic people that they know that wouldn't talk to them anyway. So I think from a member satisfaction perspective, you have to be proactive about it, because if you're reactive, you're only hearing the things that people want you to hear. And it's not always, it's like the news media today, right? You hear these polarizing things, but reality is probably in the middle of those polarizing things for most people. And it's the same at clubs. And so I would say from that perspective, member satisfaction, that's how you can monitor it. But then there's the financial piece, which I think is more important, right? I mean, understanding what healthy debt ratios are. I think you've had some people on here talking about club benchmarking, maybe talking about debt. You definitely don't want to take on too much debt. To understand, if you're a board member, if you want to do capital improvements, how do your capital reserves work? What are you charging member? What are you assessing? And will an assessment pass, right? Because there's a lot of times, especially younger members, the younger the member under 50, they do not want assessment. They just don't. They don't care as much about the club as the people who are older. They don't care about the Gilhan's redesign, even though they would like it. They don't want to pay, $15,000 for it. And so you really have to understand your financial health as well, and understand what's coming up. We've done a capital study. There's a lot of different capital reserve studies that are done. Clubs understand over the next 10 years, how much capital do we need? How are we going to pay for that? So the thoughtful boards are really digging in to make sure this is not a 3-year, this is not a 3-year business, or, it is how are we here in
legacy
50 years, right? And there's a lot of things that have to be done. Yeah, there's a lot of things that have to be done. A lot of capital that has to go in year after year after year after year in order to be here in 50 years. And if you're just spending money on discretionary things or things that aren't valuable, or you're, assessing members for a new fitness center that only, 10% of the members want, well, that, you're going to run into problems with membership, probably, or running problems with not being able to raise the capital that you need.
Yeah, there's a component also, and this is just sometimes your staff and especially general manager or head pro, some of the leadership roles inside the club. High visibility is really crucial. Being out, interacting, and of course, hand in hand with that is just open communication. There can never really be too much communication. So I think as a member, if you see the focal points of your leadership team at the club, and they are available, and they're there to receive questions, even just casually. You're entering the clubhouse from the parking lot, you're just going to dinner, and you see them, and there's something that was on your brain earlier that week or right in that moment or whatever it might be. Hey, what's with all the cars in the back section? What are those folks doing? Or whatever it is. It's just lighthearted stuff, but it certainly supports healthy communication about what's happening at the club. And I think you feel more involved with what's going on, and then maybe something piques your curiosity or your interest, and that moves the conversation along into something that's a little more meaningful than just the granular stuff that you're curious about. Maybe it gives you some insight as to what's really happening, or they say, hey, speaking of, we have some programming along that line next week. Did you make sure that you signed up for the Easter brunch, or whatever it is? They can read into your questions and your curiosities, and they can give you some feedback that points towards what's going on in their world. So while the financial component is a little tougher, I think that's mostly the board that handles it and should be, healthily responsible for it. I think a lot of that just is made up by a great staff. I mean, at the end of the day, it is a hospitality industry, and offering great service to, members and staff is a crucial component, in my opinion.
Hope you all enjoyed that episode, part 1. Be on the lookout for part 2, which is probably going to be right after this one. Catch you on the next one.